Our Town is a 1938 metatheatrical three-act play by American playwright Thornton Wilder which won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. The play tells the story of the fictional American small town of Grover's Corners between 1901 and 1913 through the everyday lives of its citizens. Thornton Ivan Wilder, April 17, 1897 – December 7, 1975, was an American playwright and novelist. He won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, for the novel The Bridge of San Luis Rey and for the plays Our Town and the Skin of Our Teeth, and a U.S. National Book Award for the novel The Eighth Day. Throughout, Wilder uses metatheatrical devices, setting the play in the actual theater where it is being performed. The main character is the stage manager of the theater who directly addresses the audience, brings in guest lecturers, fields questions from the audience, and fills in playing some of the roles. The play is performed without a set on a mostly bare stage. With a few exceptions, the actors mime actions without the use of props. Our Town was first performed at McCarter Theater in Princeton, New Jersey, in 1938. It later went on to success on Broadway and won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Described by Edward Albee as the greatest American play ever written, the play remains popular today and revivals are frequent. Summary. Act 1. Daily Life. The stage manager introduces the audience to the small town of Grover's Corners, New Hampshire, and the people living there as a morning begins in the year 1901. Joe Crowell delivers the paper to Doc Gibbs, Howie Newsome delivers the milk, and the Webb and Gibbs households send their children Emily and Wally Webb, George and Rebecca Gibbs off to school on this beautifully simple morning. Professor Willard speaks to the audience about the history of the town. Editor Webb speaks to the audience about the town's socio-economic status, political and religious demographics, and the accessibility and proliferation, or lack thereof, of culture and art in Grover's Corners. The stage manager leads us through a series of pivotal moments throughout the afternoon and evening, revealing the characters' relationships and challenges. It is at this time when we are introduced to Simon Stimson, an organist and choir director at the Congregational Church. We learn from Mrs. Luella Soames that Simon Stimson is an alcoholic when she, Mrs. Gibbs, and Mrs. Webb stop on the corner after choir practice and gossip like a bunch of old hens, according to Doc Gibbs, discussing Simon's alcoholism. It seems to be a well-known fact amongst everyone in town that Simon Stimson has a problem with alcohol. All the characters speak to his issue as if they are aware of it and his having seen a peck of trouble, a phrase repeated by more than one character throughout the show. While the majority of townsfolk choose to look the other way, including the town policeman, Constable Warren, it is Mrs. Gibbs who takes Simon's struggles with addiction to heart, and has a conversation with her husband, Doc Gibbs, about Simon's drinking. Underneath a glowing full moon, Act 1 ends with siblings George and Rebecca, and Emily gazing out of their respective bedroom windows, enjoying the smell of heliotrope in the wonderful or terrible moonlight, with the self-discovery of Emily and George liking each other, and the realization that they are both straining to grow up in their own way. The audience is dismissed to the first intermission by the stage manager who quips, "That's the end of Act 1, folks. You can go and smoke, now. Those that smoke." Act 2. Love and Marriage. 3 years have passed, and George and Emily prepare to wed. The day is filled with stress. Howie Newsome is delivering milk in the pouring rain while C. Crowell, younger brother of Joe, laments how George's baseball talents will be squandered. George pays an awkward visit to his soon-to-be in-laws. Here, the stage manager interrupts the scene and takes the audience back a year, to the end of Emily and George's junior year. Emily confronts George about his pride, and over an ice cream soda, they discuss the future and confess their love for each other. George decides not to go to college, as he had planned, but to work and eventually take over his uncle's farm. In the present, George and Emily say that they are not ready to marry, George to his mother, Emily to her father, but they both calm down and happily go through with the wedding. Act 3. Death and Eternity. 9 years have passed. The stage manager, in a lengthy monologue, discusses eternity, focusing attention on the cemetery outside of town and the people who have died since the wedding, including Mrs. Gibbs' pneumonia, while traveling Wally Webb burst appendix, while camping Mrs. Soames, and Simon Stimson suicide by hanging. Town undertaker Joe Stoddard is introduced, as is a young man named Sam Craig who has returned to Grover's Corners for his cousin's funeral. That cousin is Emily, who died giving birth to her and George's second child. Once the funeral ends, Emily emerges to join the dead. Mrs. Gibbs urges her to forget her life, warning her that being able to see but not interact with her family, all the while knowing what will happen in the future, will cause her too much pain. Ignoring the warnings of Simon, Mrs. Soames, and Mrs. Gibbs, Emily returns to Earth to relive one day, her 12th birthday. She joyfully watches her parents and some of the people of her childhood for the first time in years, but her joy quickly turns to pain as she realizes how little people appreciate the simple joys of life. The memory proves too painful for her and she realizes that every moment of life should be treasured. When she asks the stage manager if anyone truly understands the value of life while they live it, he responds, no. The saints and poets, maybe they do some. Emily returns to her grave next to Mrs. Gibbs and watches impassively as George kneels weeping over her. The stage manager concludes the play and wishes the audience a good night. Stage manager, a narrator, commentator, and guide through Grover's Corners. He joins in the action of the play periodically, as the minister at the wedding, the soda shop owner, a local townsman, etc., and speaks directly to Emily after her death. Emily Webb, one of the main characters, we follow her from a precocious young girl through her wedding to George Gibbs and her early death. George Gibbs, the other main character, the boy next door, a kind but irresponsible teenager who matures over time and becomes a responsible husband, father and farmer. Frank Gibbs, George's father, the town doctor. Julia Hersey Gibbs, George's mother. She dreams of going to Paris but doesn't get there. She saved $350 for the trip from the sale of an antique furniture piece but willed it to George and Emily. Dies while visiting her daughter in Ohio. Charles Webb, Emily's father, editor of the Grover's Corners Sentinel. Myrtle Webb, Emily and Wally's mother. Secondary characters. Joe and C. Crow, local paperboys. Joe's intelligence earns him a full scholarship to MIT where he graduates at the top of his class. His promise will be cut short on the fields of France during World War I, according to the stage manager. Both he and his brother C hold marriage in high disdain. Simon Stimson, the choir director and church organist. We never learn the specific cause of his alcoholism and suicide, although Joe Stoddard, the undertaker, observes that he's seen a peck of troubles. He remains bitter and cynical even beyond the grave. Some critics interpret Simon as a closeted homosexual. 3-4. Howie Newsom, the milkman, a fixture of Grover's Corners. Rebecca Gibbs, George's younger sister. Later elopes with a traveling salesman and settles in Ohio. Wallace, Wally, Webb, Emily's younger brother. Dies of a burst appendix on a Boy Scout camping trip. Professor Willard, a rather long-winded lecturer. Woman, nth balcony attendee of editor Webb's political and social report concerned with temperance. Belligerent man at back of auditorium attendee of editor Webb's political and social report concerned with social justice. Lady in a box attendee of editor Webb's political and social report concerned with culture and beauty. Mrs. Luella Soames, a gossipy townswoman and member of the choir. Constable Bill Warren, the policeman. 3 baseball players who mock George at the wedding. Joe Stoddard, the undertaker. Sam Craig, a nephew of Mrs. Gibbs who left town to seek his fortune. He came back after 12 years in Buffalo for Emily's funeral. Man from among the dead. Woman from among the dead. Mr. Carter, dead. Farmer McCarty. Bessie, Howie Newsom's horse, visible to the characters, but not the audience. The play is set in the actual theater where the play is being performed, but the date is always May 7, 1901. The stage manager of the May 7, 1901, production introduces the play within the play, which is set in the fictional community of Grover's Corners, New Hampshire. The stage manager gives the coordinates of Grover's Corners as 42 degrees 40 feet north latitude and 70 degrees 37 feet west longitude. Those coordinates are actually in Massachusetts, about 1,000 feet off the coast of Rockport, and at the beginning of Act 3 he mentions several real New Hampshire landmarks in the vicinity: Mount Monadnock and the towns of Jaffrey, Jaffrey Center, Peterborough, and Dublin. Wilder was dissatisfied with the theater of his time. I felt that something had gone wrong. I began to feel that the theater was not only inadequate, it was evasive. His response was to use a metatheatrical style. Our town's narrator, the stage manager, is completely aware of his relationship with the audience, leaving him free to break the fourth wall and address them directly. According to the script, the play is to be performed with little scenery, no set and minimal props. Wilder's reasoning was, I tried to restore significance to the small details of life by removing the scenery. The spectator through lending his imagination to the action restages it inside his own head. In its healthiest ages the theater has always exhibited the least scenery. The characters mime the objects with which they interact. Their surroundings are created only with chairs, tables, staircases, and ladders. For example, the scene in which Emily helps George with his evening homework, conversing through upstairs windows, is performed with the two actors standing atop separate ladders to represent their neighboring houses. Wilder once said, "Our claim, our hope, our despair are in the mind, not in things, not in scenery." Quote. Wilder called Our Town his favorite out of all his works, but complained that it was rarely done right, insisting that it should be performed without sentimentality or ponderousness, simply, dryly, and sincerely.